A parachute sea anchor is what it sounds like. It's a sea anchor that looks like a parachute. And it's going to be rather large because it's going to be deployed off the front of your boat like a typical sea anchor. And when you do deploy this equipment, it's because you want to passively wait out the storm. I want to stop, I want to go down below, catch up on some rest, or maybe it's a situation where the mast had broken or you have some kind of equipment failures. I've had a lot of boaters come up to me and say, well, you know, my whole crew was seasick. I shouldn't have left when I left port. Everybody got sick, so that's why I deployed the parachute sea anchor. And you should expect a drift rate of about half a nautical mile to a nautical mile every hour versus 10 nautical miles if I had no parachute sea anchor, if I was just buying a hull. A speed limiting drogue is going to be a very small device, and that's going to be deployed from the stern of the boat. When I do my tests for comparison purposes, when I'm testing all the different products on the market, I usually will go 7 knots with the various boats that I've been on, just to see how much these speed limiting drogues will actually slow the boat down. And normally it's about 1.5 knots to 2.5 knots that will slow your boat down. And the drogue itself, the speed limiting drogue, is designed to improve steering on the boat and hopefully slow it down so it doesn't come racing down a wave, surfing down a wave like a surfer does near the beach. Surfing so fast that it starts burying the bow and broaching or spinning the boat sideways. Now, there's another device called a stopping drogue, which has a lot of cones attached to it. It's going to be similar to a speed limiting drogue in the sense that you're deploying it from the stern. However, it's going to be much more like a parachute sea anchor in the sense that, wow, it grabs a lot of water and you're going to passively wait out the storm. You're going to go down below, catch up on your rest, and then hopefully the storm will blow by rather quickly, which they normally do. In the conditions I've been in the past, 24 hours, usually conditions will mellow out on you. Sometimes it's 48 hours. Which device is going to be best for you? A parachute sea anchor, a speed limiting drogue, or a stopping drogue? To me, it's personal preference. I know there's a lot of writings out there, a lot of articles and so forth that say, oh no, this is the only way to go. To me, it inevitably is going to be personal preference, number one. Number two will be boat design. Boat design will play a big factor in what drag device might work best for you. For example, a full keel sailboat can heave to rather easily, right? I just use sail balance in gale conditions and I don't have to deploy anything. But if you own a Beneteau like I do, which is a fin keel light displacement boat, guess what? I can't really get it to heave to, not for very long anyway. So I would have to deploy a parachute sea anchor. For me, I may prefer to do a parachute anchor because of issues of exhaustion like I talked about already. And normally I'm on a limited crew, a small crew. One other person most of the time is who I go cruising with if it's long distance. If you have a canoe stern boat, you've got a stern that's similar to the bow. It slices right through the water, or some of the center cockpits I notice, even though they might be a little bit flat on the back, have really good water exiting areas. So you could use a stopping drogue, it won't be no issue. So really, boat design plays a little bit of factor, but personal preference is going to be the biggest issue. Yes?
What about a catamaran?
A multi-hull, I prefer to use parachute sea anchors on multi-hulls because you have so much windage on that boat. That's a good thing because it really keeps tension in the line for the parachute. If you want to run, the personal preference thing, whether you bow deploy or stern deploy the drogue, it behaves very well because of the same reason. You want to go fast. And anytime your boat wants to drift fast, it keeps tension in the system. Probably no surprise, drag devices have been around for centuries. If I had to venture a guess, likely there were some sailors out there a few hundred years ago and a mast or something broke during a storm. I think Masters and Commanders with Russell Crowe is a beautiful video example of that. It falls into the water, starts to drag, slow the boat down. They all went, wow, this is great. Just stabilize the boat, you know. So that's probably how they originally started using those devices. Then later on, they started making cone-style anchors. These look like windsocks at the airport or a snow cone type device is what they normally look like. And they would use them, the merchant ships, because of their design, most likely, and the heaviness of these boats. They could easily heave to. So that might explain why they used them off the bow and on the stern, which has led to modern day confusion of which end do you deploy a parachute sea anchor, or can you deploy a parachute sea anchor on the bow and the stern? And the answer to that is no. Parachute sea anchors are so large, if I'm going to deploy it, I'm going to deploy it off the front of my boat because that's the part of the boat I want facing the waves. Okay, I don't want to take, but for my Beneteau, I don't want a cockpit full of water. The basic setup on a parachute sea anchor is going to be the deployment rope that's attached to your boat that leads to the parachute itself. And then there's going to be a trip line on the outside of the parachute sea anchor. The trip line is what allows you to pick up the chute when you're done using it. Normally the deployment rope, the anchor rope, whoops, sorry about that. The anchor rope here is going to be 10 times the length of your boat. So if it's a 40-foot boat, you're looking at carrying about 400 feet of road for worst case storm scenarios. Trip lines, I keep them at about 50 feet to 100 feet. That's the trip line right here that's attached to the outside of the parachute itself. It's just easier to handle a 50-foot and 100-foot trip line when you're deploying the equipment.
So the trip line doesn't come back to the boat?
No, the trip line does not come back to the boat. We'll go over that a little bit later, but a full trip line would be attached to the boat, and I tell you, it's a nightmare to pay out a bunch of nylon deployment rod, then your trip line. I mean, you're usually one person that's deploying equipment, and tangles are likely in a situation like that. In the video, instruction video I have, I show in flat, calm weather, you can see that trip line wrapping around the nylon rope. Right here, I always pass over the lifelines and any kind of hardware or railing, simply because I'm used to passing stuff over the lifelines when I deploy equipment. And a lot of times the fender at the end of the trip line won't fit underneath the lifelines, unless you have to force it underneath it. So by deploying everything over the lifelines, you avoid any kind of mistakes like that. Now, some people prefer to deploy in the cockpit area, which is fine, if that's what you prefer to do. I'm still going to run the line over midship, over the lifelines, and then I'm going to either attach it to, tie it off on the tow rail or on a cleat. And I usually bring back about 150 feet of line. I don't want to necessarily have 400 feet of line in the cockpit when I go to deploy the equipment. Now, a lot of people have written about securing the deployment rod along the tow rail on the outside of everything and using string to tie it off. Every time I've tied stuff off with string and I go to deploy the parachute sea anchor, it won't break, you know. And if it does break, it's likely too weak a setup. So when say you're sailing and you're hitting some rough weather, the lines will start the string will start to break, and then your rope ends up in the water. If you want to avoid that, just do it this way, and you'll never have any issues. The trip line always goes in the water first. Okay, I'm going to drop it on the windward side of the boat. The wind is now pushing my boat so that I'm drifting to leeward. Okay, I want to make sure that the boat moves away from the trip line before I drop the parachute sea anchor into the water. If it's just sitting there, then you're going to have to do something to help increase your drift, pay out some more sail, kick your engine in reverse, that kind of setup. When you grab the parachute sea anchor, it doesn't matter what brand it is. A lot of parachute anchors come with deployment bags, which are permanently attached on the parachute. They wrap around the chute, so you drop the bag and so forth in the water. We don't use deployment bags. Either way, you want to have your hand on top of the hardware, right? Keep control, maintain control of the stainless hardware, so that way, when you go to deploy it, you're not dropping the hardware, right, on the deck where it clanks, and then now the chutes and lines are all over the place, which is it's not the end of the world. If this does happen, then go ahead, grab the hardware, and before you drop the hardware in the water, go ahead and throw the parachute and all the shroud lines in the water first. Now drop the hardware, you know, into the water. After all these years of just basically doing a trial and error, going out in different weather conditions, be it calm to storm force conditions, we've tried all the different instructions in reference to deploying the equipment, and there was one pattern that has definitely stuck out, and is that if you get long periods of slack rope, the drag device isn't holding your boat anymore. It's usually collapsing. In a parachute anchor case, it's almost completely collapsing, turning into a flat pancake underwater, where sometimes it will invert inside out, but then all of a sudden your boat's swinging sideways because nothing's holding. You're lying a hole now. Okay, and once you're beam to, the waves will start catching, and you'll start rolling and pitching really heavily. And then at some point, that parachute is going to reinflate, and then that line tightens up, and boy, does it whip your bow into the weather rather quickly. That's called shock loading, and that will break rope very quickly in those particular situations. The industry standard is to use all nylon rod. It's been that way for, gosh, decades. For us, we kind of mix Dacron and nylon for Fiorentino, simply because we're trying to look for something that's less, has more chafe resistance. And it does limit the stretch a little bit in that kind of situation.
Rope with the parachute.
Yeah, every company has where you can just buy the drag device individually or you can buy it as a package. I'm sure everybody has something like that. You know, the discount packages, you know, things like that. That's common with all the manufacturers. The recommendation in general is going to be 10 to 15 feet for every foot of boat. And there's one situation where an engineer recommended 20 feet for the times the height of the wave, which could be 1,000 feet, or it could be just an amazing amount of rope, which I think is not realistic in those particular situations. And this isn't anything above calm weather. And I think this is what's led to a lot of the problems in reference to deployment, is everybody's been paying out so much rope, you're getting all that stretch that I was talking, all that slack I was talking about, and of course the boat starts swinging, you know, back and forth, creating all that shock loading. So what we recommend is to always pay out just a couple boat lengths if you're going to do calm weather deployment. If you're in gale force conditions, I pay out about 150 feet of line. And this is all to start with, because sometimes the boat may start to feel like it's being pulled down into a wave, right? Usually that means the line's a little too short. If you're being pulled down into the wave, it feels like you're going to sink. The boat's going to sink in that particular situation. If it's a storm condition, I usually pay out half my rope, okay, and play it by ear from there. On average, I think it's been 250 feet that we use for storm deployments, to give you a rough idea of how much rope we actually deployed. And all this is to maintain constant force in that rope. I want that rope tight like a cable so the parachute stays inflated. This is one solution, is just deploying out rope. That's what I prefer to do. Remember, this is all personal preference, and this just gives you ideas on how you might want to handle the deploying the equipment itself. I don't like to mess with chain, but chain is another solution of getting rid of slack. So if you want to play out storm lengths of rope, or you want to pay out 90% of your rope all the time, then add about 6 feet of chain. I just use 3/8 chain. I have 5/8 inch stainless shackles. I just run them through the links at the end of the chain, right? So I can shackle it to the swivel on the hardware of the parachute, and then to the rope itself. It makes it something I can remove if I want to. But what that does again is, there's lots of slack in that rope. That chain's going to sink, and then that will help keep the parachute inflated the entire time. So that way I don't have it collapsing and having all that lag time for when my boat's swinging back and forth, or when there's rope oscillation, because you can't stop rope oscillation. In other words, it's going to be stretching and relaxing all the time. I'm just trying to limit it so that the device works a lot more often. Let's say we've done everything correctly. Okay, solution one, paid out rope, the bridle length rope to keep everything taut, or we added some chain by the parachute and deployed the whole thing. The boat is still, a monohull sailboat's going to still swing back and forth. Okay, it's just the nature of the beast. So we have a couple solutions for that. We can attach a short line to the primary rope that leads to the parachute, so we can heave to. We can bridle, so we're going to be off the wind about 45 degrees. Or we can do a head-to-wind deployment and fly a riding sail. Those are our two options, head-to-wind, or we can heave to with the parachute sea anchor. Wrap that around the primary winch to be able to form our bridle. The trick is to wait for your stern to swing to windward, okay? As the boat swings to windward, now you're at the optimal angle to go ahead and start cranking in on that line, okay? That pulls it back so that the block will sit roughly around the shroud line area of the sailboat. The cable shroud line actually ends up rather close to the boat itself. So always wait for it to swing to windward. Let your boat be the muscle. That way it's not a hard workout for you. If you're head to wind, and you start cranking in that line, almost every time that block goes racing up the rope, and it will hit the hull of your boat. Now you got to slacken the line and wait for the block to fall back in the water. Some sailboats don't like to heave to very well at all, but some of them behave very well when it's head to wind on the parachute sea anchor. This is a picture of Steve Ashu's boat. His fairlead is massive, so he can run whatever the heck he wants out there. Nothing's going to break. In reference to a head-to-wind position. Most of the time in even my old instruction video, you're seeing us pay rope outside of the anchor roller, which is something you should never do in real life. That was more for aesthetics reasons, because it made it look smoother, the video itself. However, we bent the anchor roller in that same video, and there was only, what, 30 knot winds maybe? And it was really light conditions, and most boats aren't going to be able to handle rope being deployed through the anchor roller. I always tend to deploy it either out of a chock, or just a little further aft, I'll attach my deployment rod to a cleat. And if I'm going to do any long distance traveling, obviously I would want to remove this ground anchor here, because that's a major chafing point when I'm deploying for a head-to-wind station. Now what we did, we went outside the Golden Gate Bridge when we were conducting a lot of tests a few years ago on different fin keel boats. And every time we tried the standard of fixing the riding sail to the boat, which is what you do for mooring and other anchorages a lot of times with these riding sails, it just didn't work that often. So we started flying the riding sail like a kite. It was a free-flying riding sail, and we're like going, oh wow, this worked almost every time. It was actually pretty exciting for us to actually be able to keep that head to wind. There's always going to be some, bouncing around, but worked really great. Right now, the industry standard is to deploy chain only from the boat end. In some cases, they were recommending in the middle of the rope to help dampen shock loading and stuff. I think it's only useful for chafing, but only to the point that I'm only going to pay out a few inches of chain past that roller. Because the kind of recommendations we're getting with this chain is to deploy up to 150 feet of chain. And that is just, as you know, being in rough seas, an incredibly difficult thing to do. And I think it's going to definitely increase the risk of someone being injured, and it would put a lot of force on your windlass. Because I don't like, by the way, because you made that comment about windlasses, I don't like to attach stuff to windlasses if I can keep from it. Yeah, try to avoid that. Oh yeah, there can be a lot of force on this equipment, definitely. But not as much as you think. It's a lot of force for a human to hold on to the line. The overall, if you keep that constant force in the line, it really isn't that much, usually a couple thousand pounds, which is still more than we can all lift. Now, the only thing on the chain, when you deploy through the roller again, remember, rollers usually get destroyed. That's the number one reason I don't like running stuff through the anchor roll, unless it's really beefy setup. If you have a nice beefy setup, then it's not going to be an issue. But when you do run chain out from the roller, if you're doing a head-to-wind station, and now you want to switch to a heave-to position with a parachute anchor, even more difficult. Because now you're going to have to shackle, in bouncing weather, you're going to have to have a short line where you actually shackle to the chain, and then bring that rope line back to a primary winch. And that is a really difficult thing. This was calm weather, and I was having a nightmare just to get these photos shot. And that kind of angle will put a lot of force on one side of the roller. Another reason that'll likely bend your bracket in that situation. Now, on the bridle sets for most of the trawlers and some of the motor sailors, I tend to affix them or anchor them amidship. They seem to behave better that way. If you're going to heave to with a trawler or a motor sailor, usually it's 10 degrees off the wind, with the anchoring point being amidship. And I know on my Beneteau, I did the same thing, but in calm weather, it seemed to work better when I had the bridle affixed amidships in the middle of the boat versus in the cockpit area. When the winds were stronger, it was better when the line was attached stern. So something just to keep in mind if you are setting up a bridle and having issues with it, that you can anchor it at a couple different locations. When I'm setting up the bridles for a multi-hull, I don't like them very far from the boat. I think the industry standard could be anywhere from 2.5 times the beam of the boat to, I've seen them 60 feet or more in length. Well, when you have bridles that long, they're going to go slack at some point. So one line is going to become taut, and that's the angle where your boat's going to start to swing. It puts all the force on one side of the boat, which will lead to shock loading and breakage. So I really prefer to use much shorter lines, 1 foot for every foot of boat. So if I have a four, that's the same for all the boats. Monohull, multi-hulls, 1 foot for every foot of boat is the line length for the bridle setups. And you can either tie them off on a cleat, or you can go ahead and shackle your bridles by the crossbar beam. I know a lot of times they have brackets there where you can do it. Some people have hull eyes placed in the multi-hull for that reason. Once you have that trip line in your hand, normally there's enough engine speed that your forward progression can still make you start going towards the parachute. So I always signal the helmsperson to motor in reverse slightly and then to maintain station. I wanted to maintain station and not move. Yeah. So as I pull in that trip line, that will spin the chute around and will close like an umbrella. It's usually a rather easy process. You should be able to do everything by hand. If the sea states is too rough for you to be able to pull it in by hand, then maybe you better wait. I think 12-foot seas is still relatively easy to bring the parachute anchor on board. But anything over that does require a little bit of practice in that situation. As I bring in the parachute itself, I always use the boat edge as leverage, because what if I have a really big boat with a really big parachute, and I'm maybe not quite have the strength to bring the weight of a 70-pound parachute. You can always hold onto that trip line and walk backwards. Use your body as a little extra muscle to help bring your parachute on board. The edge of the boats are really, really nice for that purpose. Correct. And then you have to let the rope out rather quick. That's why when I'm doing training, you'll hear me say trip line in the water, wait for you to drift. Now you drop the parachute sea anchor, wait for your boat to drift some more. Now you pay out your rope rather quickly. On the parachute sea anchors, everything's a little bit more slow. Storm drogues, when I talk about that section, that's a much faster pace thing. And there are pros and cons to using either a parachute sea anchor or a storm drogue. The parachute anchor, I think, is in some respect a little easier to deploy simply because everything's a little slower. The drogue is so fast, you've got to get those lines overboard, otherwise they start wrapping around things you don't want wrapped around. So we've come, oh, go ahead.
How heavy is that parachute sea anchor?
It's going to be dependent on the size of the parachute anchor. I would say the average cruising boat's it'll be 19 pounds to 27 pounds. That's a 9 and 12 footer. They're lighter weight versions of that. Companies make lighter chutes than that even. And then about 35, 40 pounds for the bigger chutes for the real big cruising boats. We'll get more into the parachute sizing a little bit later.
So your rope is really the biggest weight you've got.
The anchor rope is going to be the thing that weighs the most out of the whole. And normally for 5/8 inch diameter rope, since it's going into the next slide anyway, 5/8 inch to 3/4 inch is the common diameters for the rope being used on the parachute sea anchors. 5/8 is, for every 100 feet, it's like 10 pounds, basically. And then I think 15 pounds for 100 feet for the 3/4 inch line. If you're going to have a deployment bag, I tend to add about 20 feet of chain because that's the one device that tends to float longer and I'm comfortable with. I want to get that thing underwater really quickly. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so if you've got like a second, anchor road that has less chain than your primary and plenty of road, can you use that for this, or do you suggest always having a dedicated?
You don't have to have a dedicated line for your parachute anchor or storm drogue. If you have a secondary anchor that's a spare line that you almost never use or something, why not? You know, as long as it has the length that you need for deployment, you've got it covered, most definitely.
What type of line do you recommend?
It can be actually just for rope leading to the parachute sea anchor, as long as it's nylon, Dacron, Spectra. I've been on Steve Dashue's Wind Horse. He's an author of many books, and he uses all Spectra for a lot of his drag devices. You know, the only thing, if you're going to use Spectra line, the line does float a lot. It will bunch up on the surface, so you have to add weight to the drag device to remove all of that slack. And that is a contradiction to the industry standard, which is they're always saying all nylon. We want lots of stretch, pay out lots of rope, no matter what. If it's calm conditions, maybe not, but afterwards pay out lots of rope.
So three-strand nylon anchor.
You can use 3-strand rope. Now that becomes a parachute design issue. Is the parachute going to rotate, or is it going to stay, you know, nice and straight so that the line doesn't unravel? And you may or may not have to add a swivel at the boat end. That'll be, you know, your decision. And if you're going to use a swivel, most of them are bolted, meaning that it doesn't take much to break a bolt. And so you'll need a big, beefy swivel so that it will spin better and has more strength to it. So.
And don't those pair anchors have a swivel at the parachute end?
Yes, there's a swivel at the parachute sea anchor, and for all the companies, but most of them come to a single strap webbing, or they're not spread out very much. And they're usually using, surprisingly in some cases, very small swivels, which I know are going to lock up on you. They have a tendency to lock up when there's force on them. She's talking about where the boat's sitting on top of the parachute at the same time that the parachute sea anchor's in the opposing wave. The further away the parachute is from the boat, not as relevant whether it's in the wave sink or not. It is when it's really close to the boat itself. And you'll notice this during retrieval, that obviously during retrieval, the parachute, as you're pulling up on it, it's still going to be inflated. If it's out of sync, it pulls the boat down. You start to feel that motion like that. So I only notice it in that situation. The 2 wavelength thing came about in the industry simply because it's easier to describe storm wave conditions, you know, 50, 100-foot waves. That's what that really applies to, but under most conditions that people are using this stuff, the waves aren't that extreme. So if it's you know, say you pay out 75% of your line, I wouldn't worry about the wavelength thing. You're not going to see it. You're going to have to go by feel. And if your boat, say we've done everything right, the boat is stable, you're like, oh wow, I'm very comfortable. I only paid out, you know, 250 feet of rope because that's what Zach said to. I didn't say that exactly, but that's what you remembered. So you paid out 250 feet. All of a sudden, the boat is falling into that trough because the sea conditions became larger. Okay, we don't have enough rope paid out at this point, and yes, it's going to be a bear with that line having tension on to slacken it. And the only way to do that is to motor forward, and to generate that kind of slack and then pay out additional. That's why there's more than one way of deploying this equipment. Okay. If I don't want to do rope adjustments, then I pay out all my rope and add the chain at the parachute end. Okay, those are the two options you have. But some boats don't like that position. So my other option is head to wind, bow into the weather, flying my free-flying riding sail. Some of the catch rigs, they can sheet in their mizzen. I will tie a preventer line onto the boom itself and maybe tie the preventer line up forward a little bit to help angle the boat so that it maintains head to wind. But catch can do that, catch rig, but a lot of the other boats, they need to have a riding sail that they fly freely. You can use a storm sail. What if you have a storm stay sail or something else? You can improvise with some of this equipment. I got to turn things off for the next speaker. If you have any questions, I'll be available. I'm outside. I got a booth so we can talk more.